So if you were to ask 100 modern sociologists how to define the good life, you are going to get, well, probably 100 incredibly complex answers.
Oh, at least 100, yeah.
Right. You'd get these overlapping spectrums of, identity and privilege and these really intricate moral frameworks. Because today, I mean, we have built an entire vocabulary around nuance.
We really have.
We love the gray areas. We love psychological complexities and this idea that human morality is just like this infinite gradient. But the stack of sources we are diving into today for this deep dive, they look at all that modern nuance and they claim it is completely, utterly wrong.
Yeah, it's a hard pivot.
It is. We are looking at an ancient text,
Yeah.
specifically Psalm 1, that violently rejects the gray area. It claims there are basically only two types of human beings on the entire face of the earth.
And it is a staggering claim. It leaves absolutely zero room for negotiation.
None at all.
Right. We're looking at the opening poem of the biblical book of Psalms, obviously. But our specific lens today is a deep dive into how these really intense Reformed Christian theologians interpret this exact text.
And these are just, casual devotional.
No, not at all. These sources are highly structured, deeply analytical texts. They break down this ancient Hebrew poem. They parse out all its vivid agricultural and legal imagery, and then they apply that ancient, uncompromising binary directly to 21st century cultural and political battles.
And because these authors are using a 2,500-year-old poem as a sledgehammer against modern sociology, we really need to be clear about our mission today with you, the listener.
Absolutely.
Because these theologians pull absolutely no punches. They use their interpretation of Psalm 1 to aggressively critique things like modern progressive movements, critical race theory, church marketing strategies, and even specific charismatic religious practices.
Yeah, they touch on all the third rails.
Exactly. So our goal here is not to take a side in those massive cultural battles. And we are definitely not validating or endorsing the specific political or religious viewpoints contained in these texts. We are simply here to dissect the anatomy of their argument.
Right, we're just unpacking the mechanics of it.
Yeah, we're looking at the historical context, the linguistic nuances of the Hebrew, and really the internal logic these specific authors use to arrive at their explosive modern conclusions.
And the internal logic is the key to all of this, really. If
Right.
we want to understand how they bridge that massive gap from an ancient poem to a critique of modern political theory, we have to start with the actual architecture of the book itself.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So the sources make this really compelling case that you can't just open a massive sprawling anthology of ancient poetry without dealing with the front door. And Psalm 1 is, it is the ultimate doorkeeper for the entire Psalter.
The structural placement is so fascinating to me because the Book of Psalms is divided into 5 distinct books, right? And in the first book, almost every single psalm has a superscription. Like you get a little title telling you the author, usually David, or the historical event that inspired the song.
Yeah, like when he was fleeing from Absalom or hiding in a cave, things like that.
Exactly. But Psalm 1 has no superscription, it names no author, it mentions no specific battle, no historical crisis, no geography. It is just completely anonymous.
Which is an incredibly rare anomaly for that section of the text.
Yeah.
So the confessional scholarship we were reviewing argues that this anonymity is a highly deliberate editorial choice.
They did it on purpose.
Entirely on purpose. By severing the poem from one specific historical crisis, the final editors of Israel's hymn book gave it this universal programmatic function. It stands at the literal gate of the text, interrogating every single reader who wants to enter. The premise is basically that you are not allowed to sing the soaring songs of royal hope or the desperate laments or the weeping that come later in the book until you have reckoned with the fundamental division presented right here in chapter 1. It asks you, how are you approaching the divine?
And the sources also point out that it's intentionally paired with Psalm 2, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like the two poems function as this massive double-hinged doorway because Psalm 1 begins with the Hebrew word asher, which translates to blessed, blessed is the man. And then Psalm 2 concludes with the exact same word, blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Right, they completely bracket the introduction. It creates this unified theological statement before you even get to the first Davidic song.
So to really grasp the weight of that doorway, we have to look at the geopolitical reality on the ground when this final compilation was happening.
Yeah, context is everything here.
Right. Because the consensus among the scholars in our sources is that the Psalter in its final form was compiled in the post-exilic period, We were
Yeah.
talking about the era of, like, Ezra the scribe and the Great Synagogue.
The Israelites had just survived a devastating generation-long captivity in Babylon.
Right, they are finally back in Jerusalem, but they are attempting to rebuild a shattered nation, a destroyed temple, and really a completely fractured identity.
And the existential threat hasn't vanished at all. It's just, changed shape.
Yeah.
They are now surrounded by the massive cultural and political and philosophical gravity of the Persian Empire, and later on, the Hellenistic influence.
So the threat is no longer just getting conquered by Babylonian swords. The actual threat is getting conquered by foreign ideas.
Exactly. It's the temptation of assimilation.
Right. They are facing this constant creeping pressure of syncretism, the blending of their strict covenantal religion with the pagan worldviews of the empires that are just dominating their region.
Because the surrounding nations operated on this belief that human success came from, appeasing capricious deities through magic or through really shrewd, compromising political alliances.
So in that high-stakes environment, our sources argue that Psalm 1 is not just this, like, idyllic piece of pastoral poetry about trees and rivers. It is a desperate survival manual.
It's a trumpet call. It's warning the returning exiles that covenantal faithfulness requires radical separation from the philosophical frameworks of the empires around them. The text is designed to aggressively strip away the illusion of neutrality.
Which really brings us to the core tension of the text. And honestly, the core tension for any modern reader engaging with this ancient worldview.
Oh, for sure.
Because the authors of our sources argue that humanity naturally defaults to viewing morality as a spectrum. But Psalm 1 divides all of humanity into two, and only two, distinct paths: the righteous and the ungodly.
There's no middle ground.
Right. But we live in a culture that views this kind of binary thinking as inherently regressive. I mean, we celebrate nuance. We recognize systemic issues, complex psychological trauma, intersectional identities. This rigid black and white framework is exactly what makes modern readers want to close the book.
And the authors of these theological texts are acutely aware of that modern discomfort. In fact, they argue that your discomfort is the entire point.
Really?
Yeah, they say it exposes a clash of ultimate authorities. These sources assert that modern secularism, and even certain progressive branches of modern theology, they attempt to divide humanity using our own fabricated categories.
Right.
We want to draw the dividing lines based on socioeconomic classes or political affiliations or racial dynamics or psychological profiles.
Because if we define the categories, we retain the power to place ourselves on the right side of history, or the right side of the spectrum.
Exactly. But the ancient text insists that the only division that actually matters, like the foundational bedrock of human existence, is spiritual alignment. You are either in a state of covenantal union with the Creator, or you are in a state of autonomous rebellion.
Wow.
And the Reformed authors argue that attempting to blur that ultimate line, or trying to replace it with our modern nuanced spectrums of morality, is actually falling victim to the exact worldly assimilation the psalm was written to prevent. To them, this binary isn't some primitive oversimplification. It is the most piercing, accurate assessment of the human condition possible.
Okay, so the framework dictates that there is absolutely no neutral ground. You cannot casually stand on the sidelines of the moral universe.
Right.
But that raises an immediate psychological problem for me. If the space are this absolute, how does someone actually end up on the wrong side of the binary? Because human psychology doesn't work in immediate, cartoonish absolutes.
No, of course not.
Nobody wakes up on a random Tuesday and consciously decides, you know what, I think I will dedicate the rest of my life to being a rebellious, ungodly scoffer. There has to be an underlying mechanism of decay, right?
And the opening verse of the poem provides that exact mechanism. It is this forensic slow-motion breakdown of moral decay. It uses a three-part negative progression, and it defines the blessed person first, but what they absolutely refuse to do.
And the sources get incredibly granular with the Hebrew parallelisms here. The text outlines three simultaneous layers of descent. First, you have a progression of physical posture: walking, then standing, then sitting.
Right.
Second, you have a progression of influence, the counsel, then the way, then the seat. And finally, you have a progression of the social crowd you are actually associating with: the ungodly, then the sinners, then the scoffers.
Yeah, it's a perfect downward spiral.
Let's look at that first step. Walking in the counsel of the ungodly. The word counsel in the ancient world wasn't just like casual passing advice. It was the fundamental framework of ideas, the assumptions, and the worldview by which a person interprets reality.
And the ungodly are characterized as restless, autonomous rebels who operate entirely outside of divine authority.
So to walk in their counsel implies a really casual, maybe curious engagement. You are moving through life, maintaining your own momentum, but you are allowing their ideas and their philosophies to shape your internal monologue.
You're entertaining their worldview as a valid option. You haven't stopped yet, but your trajectory is being altered by the ideas you are consuming.
Which leads seamlessly to the second stage, standing in the way of sinners. And the Hebrew verbs here shift from a sense of motion to a completed habitual action. You have stopped walking. You are now lingering.
Right. The way represents a practiced conduct, like a recognized manner of life.
And sinners here refers to those who habitually miss the mark. So you've gone from merely entertaining a bad idea in your head to actively practicing the lifestyle associated with it. You are hanging out in the space where the rebellion actually happens.
And that lingering is exactly what traps you. It pulls you into the final fatal stage, sitting in the seat of scoffers.
The bottom of the barrel.
Literally, the absolute bottom of the psychological spiral, because sitting implies a permanent settled belonging. In the ancient Near East, taking a seat wasn't just about, resting your legs. It suggested taking a position of authority or participation in an assembly.
Like the elders who sat at the city gate to render judgment.
Exactly. And the
Yeah.
people you were sitting with are the scoffers. These aren't just people who quietly ignore the truth or casually miss the mark. These are the arrogant intellectuals. They actively mock, deconstruct, and sneer at holiness.
The sources emphasize that this entire verse is just a masterclass in how social and moral formation works. Sin catechizes before it corrupts. It normalizes its logic slowly before it completely enslaves you.
Because the progression reveals that sin rarely announces its final destination at the trailhead. It starts with a little bit of advice, a subtle shift in perspective. Then it invites you to participate in a behavior just to see what it's like. Finally, it pulls up a chair, gives you a permanent identity, and makes you a vocal defender of the rebellion.
The modern equivalent of this is glaringly obvious to me. It's the social media algorithm.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Think about the mechanics of how online radicalization works. You are scrolling, minding your own business, and you click on one highly controversial, cynical video just out of morbid curiosity. You are just walking by, listening to the counsel.
Right, just a quick look.
But the algorithm notes that momentary pause. Within days, your entire feed is flooded with that specific brand of cynicism. You start commenting, getting involved in the heated arguments. You have stopped scrolling. You are now standing in the way. Fast forward a few months, and you've joined the dedicated private forum. You've changed your profile picture to match the group's insignia, and you spend your evenings actively mocking anyone who disagrees with your newly adopted faction.
You have taken a seat with the scoffers.
Exactly. You didn't decide to become a radical on day one. You were slowly catechized by the environment you allowed into your mind.
The algorithm analogy perfectly captures the communal aspect of this descent. The text is warning that we are constantly being formed by the communities and the ideas we inhabit. However, and this is important, the theologians in our sources are quick to clarify what this text is not saying.
Okay, what do they clarify?
They anticipate the immediate counterargument. If the blessed person must refuse all of this influence, does this ancient text demand total monastic withdrawal? Like, do you have to move to the desert, delete all technology, and refuse to speak to anyone who doesn't share your exact theology?
Because that's the logical extreme, right? If you can't walk, stand, or sit anywhere near the ungodly, you just have to leave society entirely.
Right, but the sources aggressively reject that interpretation. They point out that physical isolation is not the biblical model at all. I mean, Jesus himself famously interacted with sinners, he ate in their homes, he engaged with the hostile culture of his day.
So what's the distinction?
The distinction these authors make is about who governs your imagination and your conscience. You can be deeply embedded in the secular world, running a business, loving your neighbors, engaging in local politics, without letting the world become your primary teacher.
Ah, I see.
The text isn't demanding that you physically leave the room. It is demanding that you violently refuse to let the scoffers in the room dictate your worldview.
But here's the psychological reality that makes this so difficult. You cannot just uninstall bad software from your brain without installing a new operating system.
Right. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Yes. If you successfully isolate your mind from the counsel of the ungodly, something else is going to rush in to fill that void. Mere avoidance is not a sustainable strategy for human flourishing. You cannot build a life entirely around what you don't do.
A vacuum of desire will always be filled by a new master. And this is the brilliant pivot the poem makes in verses 2 and 3. It shifts from the negative refusal to the positive obsession. The text says the blessed person's delight is in the Torah of the Lord, and on it they meditate day and night.
Let's unpack Torah first, because, the modern ear hears that word and immediately pictures a dusty, oppressive rulebook of ancient legal codes.
Yeah, totally.
But in the covenantal background of ancient Israel, Torah has a much richer texture. It certainly includes the moral commandments, but broadly it means instruction or revelation. It is the revealed spoken will of a God who actually desires to communicate with his creation.
And the text points out that the blessed person doesn't just, grit their teeth and tolerate this instruction out of obligation. Their delight is in it. It is a fundamental affection of the heart.
And the mechanism for cultivating that delight is where the text gets incredibly visceral. The English translation says they meditate on it day and night, but the modern, often Eastern-influenced concept of meditation usually involves achieving a state of mental emptiness, right? Like a detached tranquility or sitting in absolute silence to clear the mind.
Which is exactly where the linguistic scholars in our sources drop a massive revelation. Because the Hebrew word used here for meditate is haga, and it means the exact opposite of silent mental emptiness.
Oh, what does it mean?
Haga means to murmur, to mutter, to recite in a low, audible voice. And the linguistic connection that is just wild here is that this exact same Hebrew root word is used over in Isaiah chapter 31 to describe a young lion growling over its prey.
Wait, really? Like a literal lion?
Yeah, growling over a carcass.
That is light years away from sitting quietly on a yoga mat.
Exactly. It denotes an active, vocal, almost aggressive rumination. In the oral culture of the ancient Near East, silent reading was virtually non-existent. People read aloud. So to meditate day and night meant physically filling your mouth and your ears with the text.
You are constantly murmuring it to yourself as you walk down the road.
Right. You are wrestling with the words, chewing on them, letting them digest into your system.
You are fiercely occupying your mind with truth, refusing to let it go, much like the lion refuses to surrender its meal to scavengers. The vocalization forces the text to bypass just the intellect and really settle into the nervous system.
And the result of this aggressive, lion-like meditation is the central agricultural metaphor of the entire psalm. The person who engages in this practice becomes like a tree planted by streams of water.
And the Hebrew text, again, provides nuances here that are just completely lost in standard English translations. The word used for planted is shatul. This is not the standard word for a seed that happens to fall into the dirt and grow wild by random chance. Shatul specifically means transplanted. It implies deliberate, sovereign action.
So it wasn't an accident.
Not at all. A master gardener intentionally dug this tree up from barren native soil and deliberately relocated it to a position of supreme safety and nourishment.
And the location of that safety is by streams of water. If we look at the agricultural reality of the arid Judean landscape, survival for any vegetation is incredibly precarious. I mean, this region experiences brutal, long, dry seasons and these blistering hot sirocco winds that blow in from the eastern deserts.
So a tree left to rely on natural rainfall would easily dry up and die during a drought.
Right. And the Hebrew phrase for streams Paul Jumeim does not refer to a bubbling natural brook running through a lush meadow. It refers to man-made, meticulously engineered irrigation canals. Yeah. Agriculturalists in the ancient world would cut deep channels from a central, reliable water source to bring life into the otherwise dry, cracked dirt. The tree survives the scorching heat not because it has naturally evolved tougher bark, but because its root system has tapped into a hidden, subterranean, inexhaustible supply of water.
It is drawing its life from an external source that the blazing sun cannot even touch.
Exactly. And the theological implication for the authors of our sources is profound. The blessed person possesses an invisible supply of grace that completely defies their visible, earthly circumstances. They can endure the drought of a hostile culture because they're constantly tapping into the Torah through that active, growling meditation.
But here's where we really have to address a massive point of friction. The text says that for this transplanted tree, whatever he does prospers. We have to talk about how the sources handle that phrase.
Yeah, that's a loaded word.
It is. Because isolated from its context, that sounds identical to the modern prosperity gospel. It sounds like a transactional formula, you know? Read your Bible, avoid bad influences, and God is contractually obligated to give you financial wealth, perfect health, and unending earthly success.
And the Reformed theologians in our stack of sources violently reject the prosperity gospel. They spend significant ink dismantling that specific reading. They argue that severing whatever he does prospers from the holistic biblical narrative is a fatal exegetical error.
So how do they define it?
They look to the broader context of Scripture to define what prosperity actually means to a sovereign God. And they specifically leverage the narrative of Joseph in the book of Genesis to redefine the term.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, the biblical text explicitly states that Joseph prospered, but he prospered while he was stripped of his family, sold as a slave in Egypt, and later while he was rotting in a dungeon for a crime he didn't commit. So biblical prosperity, according to this framework, has absolutely nothing to do with immunity from tragedy, suffering, or the accumulation of capital. It is defined solely as the successful, unstoppable fulfillment of God's divine purpose in a person's life, regardless of how horrific the external circumstances might appear to an observer.
And the agricultural metaphor itself really guards against the prosperity reading. The text notes that the tree yields its fruit in its season. That single phrase implies the existence of seasons where there is no visible fruit.
Exactly. There are seasons of harsh winter. There are seasons of severe, painful pruning by the gardener.
There are times when the tree appears entirely barren and useless to the outside world. Yet the text promises that the leaf does not wither because the unseen root is still drinking from the irrigation canal.
So the sources argue that applying a metric of immediate, visible financial success to Psalm 1 is to fundamentally misread the nature of a tree. The success is faithful, hidden endurance, not flashy affluence.
So we now have this deeply textured picture of the righteous path, right? Deliberately transplanted, aggressively meditating, drinking from a hidden canal, enduring the scorching heat, and producing fruit on a divine timetable. But the poem forces us to look back at the other side of the binary.
Right, the other path.
What happens to the people we left back in verse 1? What is the fate of the ungodly? The ones who seem to be successfully running the world, offering the counsel, and holding the seats of cultural power. This brings us to verse 4, which is arguably one of the most abrupt, violent transitions in ancient literature.
It really is. After 3 verses of lush, vibrant, enduring imagery, the Hebrew text hits a brick wall with just 3 words. Luck and hen are shame, not so the wicked.
Just brutal.
Everything that was just affirmed to the righteous, that they are planted, nourished, fruitful, and enduring, is instantly and completely denied to the ungodly. The devastating brevity of the phrase really underscores the total lack of substance in the wicked.
And the metaphor completely shifts. We move from a deeply rooted, irrigated tree to something terrifyingly fragile. The wicked are compared to chaff that the wind drives away.
To understand the violence of this image, we have to look closely at the ancient threshing floor.
Yeah, so in the ancient agricultural cycle, after the wheat was harvested and crushed by heavy sledges, the valuable grain had to be separated from the waste. Farmers would take the crushed mixture to a threshing floor, which was deliberately located on a high, exposed, windswept hill.
Okay.
The farmer would take a winnowing fork, scoop up the crushed mixture, and throw it high into the air.
And at that point, gravity and the wind take over to reveal the true nature of the material. The wheat grain is heavy, it has dense physical substance, it contains life, it has nutritional value. So when it is thrown into the air, gravity immediately pulls it straight back down to the stone floor to be gathered and preserved. But the chaff is the dry, dead, empty outer husk of the wheat. It has physical volume. It might look like a massive, impressive pile when it's just lying on the ground, but it has absolutely 0 root, 0 sap, and 0 internal weight.
But the moment it hits the air, the wind catches it and violently drives it away into oblivion. It is entirely at the mercy of external forces it cannot resist or control.
And the sources highlight that this is a brutal, unsparing reversal of human evaluation. Because in the real world, the chaff, the ungodly scoffers from verse 1, might be incredibly wealthy.
Right.
They might hold the highest political offices, command millions of followers, or dominate elite academic institutions. To human eyes, they look heavy, they look permanent, they dictate the culture.
But the text is declaring that in the eyes of God, because they lack any spiritual substance or connection to the divine Torah, they are completely and utterly weightless. It is a purely eschatological assessment. The poem is demanding that the reader look forward to the ultimate end of history. A stately, impressive public image can easily conceal a completely rootless, hollow soul. The chaff might seem solid and dominant while it's sitting undisturbed on the threshing floor, but its apparent solidity only exists because the wind hasn't started blowing yet.
And that wind is the inescapable reality of divine judgment. Verse 5 spells out the consequence. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment. The word stand here, grum in Hebrew, is an ancient Near Eastern legal term.
So it's not just standing up?
No, it doesn't merely mean being physically present in a courtroom. To stand means to endure the trial, to bear up under the relentless cross-examination, and to emerge acquitted, vindicated, and legally secure.
The text is declaring that the wicked won't even be able to hold their ground under the terrifying weight of the divine verdict. Because they lack the substance of the rooted tree, the sheer legal scrutiny of a holy God will simply blow them out of existence. They will have no place, no standing, and no voice in the final congregation of the righteous.
Which leads to the ultimate conclusion of the poem in verse 6. It serves as a summary statement for all of human destiny. It says, "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." And the hinge of this entire verse, and arguably the entire psalm, is the word knows.
Let's dig deeply into that word, because if we read it with a modern Western mindset, it creates a theological paradox.
Yeah, it does.
Obviously, an omniscient God knows everything. He knows the atomic weight of carbon. He knows where I left my keys, and he certainly knows exactly what the wicked are doing. So knowing in this context cannot possibly mean mere cognitive awareness or data collection.
It absolutely doesn't. The Hebrew word is yada. In the context of biblical covenantal language, yada carries immense, intimate theological weight. It means an electing, protective, relational love.
Like how?
Think of the way a husband knows a wife, or the way a mother intimately knows her child. It applies profound approval, sovereign ownership, and active providential care.
So it's not a passive observation like, I am aware that you exist on this path.
Yeah.
It is an active declaration. I am intimately and fiercely involved in guarding, preserving, and sustaining your path.
Exactly. The sources argue that this is the ultimate comfort of the text. The righteous do not endure the judgment because their path is naturally stronger, or because they are inherently better, more moral people than the scoffers.
Right.
They endure solely because Yahweh yada. He intimately knows, loves, and supernaturally guards their way. The preservation comes from the outside. Conversely, the text states that the way of the wicked perishes. It's a fascinating phrasing. It doesn't just say God actively destroys them. It says their way inherently self-destructs. The road of autonomy crumbles into the abyss of its own accord, taking all the weightless chaff with it.
And the theologians point out that human history often looks incredibly frustratingly morally confused. We look around every day and see corrupt people getting wealthy, bad actors winning elections, and seemingly good, faithful people suffering in obscurity.
It's the reality of a fallen world.
But the poem acknowledges that apparent reality but demands that the reader look through that eschatological lens. The gravity of divine judgment will eventually inevitably reveal what actually has substance. The bad guys winning is a temporary illusion of the threshing floor. The wind is coming.
Okay, so up to this exact moment in our deep dive, we have been exploring an ancient Jewish text deeply embedded in its historical, linguistic, and agricultural context.
Right.
But the stack of sources we are analyzing today are written by distinctly Christian Reformed theologians. They do not leave this poem in the ancient world. They aggressively pull it across the bridge into the 21st century.
And this is where we transition into the mechanics of their modern application. How do these scholars take a 2,500-year-old poem about an irrigation canal and a threshing floor and use it to critique modern church dynamics and sociological frameworks? What is the theological bridge they build to get from point A to point B?
The bridge is a very specific, foundational theological mechanism: Christology. These authors view the entire Old Testament and Psalm 1 specifically, exclusively through the lens of Jesus Christ. They argue that you cannot properly interpret this text without seeing Christ as the ultimate singular fulfillment of it.
Walk me through the logical steps of that Christological reading, because on a surface level, reading Jesus into a poem about a tree seems like a massive historical leap.
Well, the logic starts with the unyielding demands of the law. The authors argue that if you read the stringent requirements of Psalm 1, honestly, no normal fallen human being can actually survive the text.
Because it's impossible.
Right. Has any human perfectly, without a single failure, avoided the counsel of the ungodly for their entire life? Has any human maintained an unbroken, perfect day and night delight in the absolute holiness of God's law?
If we are being brutally honest with the text, the answer is a definitive no. Every single human has taken bad advice, laughed at a cynical scoffer's joke, or actively ignored divine instruction when it was inconvenient.
Exactly. Therefore, the law functions as a mirror to expose human failure. Because every human fails the test of verse 1, the theologians assert that Jesus Christ is the only person in human history who actually qualifies as the perfect, unblemished, blessed man of the song.
Okay, I see where they're going.
He is the only human who completely rejected the satanic counsel in the wilderness, who perfectly delighted in the Father's will even unto death, and who produced perfect fruit in his season.
So the application isn't a moralistic lecture saying, try really, really hard to be a better tree. The theological argument is that Jesus is the only true tree.
And they push the imagery even further. They argue Jesus is also the source of the water. He provides the living water that sustains the failing, broken believers who are graciously transplanted into him.
And what about the threshing floor?
That's the key for the judgment aspect. They connect him directly to the threshing floor. They draw heavily on the New Testament imagery of John the Baptist in the Gospels, who explicitly stated that the coming Messiah has his winnowing fork in his hand.
Right.
He is the one who will clear the threshing floor, gather the heavy wheat into the barn, and burn the weightless chaff with unquenchable fire. So for these Reformed authors, Jesus is the perfectly righteous man, the sustaining source of life, and the terrifying ultimate judge who brings the wind.
Okay, with that absolute Christological foundation established, let's look at how these sources turn that theology into a weaponized critique of the modern landscape. And again, as a reminder to the listener, we are impartially mapping the arguments these authors are making.
Right. We're just unpacking the claims.
They take the severe binary of Psalm 1 and apply it directly to modern battlegrounds. Let's start with their internal critique of the modern church, specifically what they label pragmatism.
Yes. The sources take direct, aggressive aim at the seeker-sensitive church movement. This is the widespread philosophy that churches should adopt modern corporate marketing strategies, utilize demographic polling, and employ secular entertainment models to make their weekend services more attractive and palatable to an unchurched secular audience.
We're talking about churches that prioritize, like concert-grade lighting, TED Talk-style motivational sermons, and tailoring the message to whatever the local demographic data says people want to hear. How do the sources use Psalm 1 to dismantle that approach?
They view pragmatism strictly through the lens of verse 1. They compare the reliance on secular marketing strategists and cultural polling data to actively walking in the counsel of the ungodly.
Wow, that's direct.
Very direct. Their logic is this. If a church looks to the unregenerate world to figure out how to structure the worship of a holy God, they are stepping onto the downward spiral. They argue that adjusting the message to appease the cultural palate is an act of syncretism.
So even if it works numerically.
Exactly. It might result in a church that looks numerically massive and financially successful, like a giant, impressive pile of chaff. But the authors argue it is actually spiritually weightless because it is disconnected from the true canal of the Word. They demand a rigid return to relying solely on the sufficiency of the biblical text, regardless of whether it's popular or marketable.
And they also aim their critique at a completely different side of the religious spectrum, mysticism. The sources take a hard stance against certain practices within the charismatic church movement.
Yes, the authors in our stack explicitly identify as cessationist. This is the theological doctrine that the miraculous sign gifts seen in the early church, such as prophecy, speaking in tongues, or receiving direct extra-biblical dreams, visions, and new revelations from God, ceased with the death of the original apostles and the completion of the New Testament canon.
And they tie that doctrine directly to the agricultural imagery of Psalm 1.
They do. They look at verse 2, which states, "The blessed man delights specifically in the Torah, the established written law." The authors argue that Psalm 1 anchors all spiritual health, guidance, and endurance strictly in the objective written word.
Oh, I see.
They view the modern pursuit of subjective, extra-biblical voices, mystical feelings, or personal prophecies as stepping away from the dependable, engineered irrigation canal of Scripture and wandering out into the lethal desert in search of a mirage. For them, true divine guidance is found exclusively by fiercely meditating on the completed Bible, not by closing your eyes and waiting for a new subjective spiritual download.
The logic is that the written text is the only water you get, and it is the only water you need to survive the heat.
Exactly.
Now, we have to tackle the most explosive and culturally charged claim in these sources. They take the absolute binary division of Psalm 1, the righteous versus the wicked, and they use it to completely dismiss massive modern sociological frameworks, specifically targeting critical race theory and broader liberal social justice ideologies.
Yeah, this is where it really heats up.
Walk me through the exact mechanics of their argument here, because this is where the ancient text violently collides with 21st century politics.
Okay, so the authors argue that modern sociological frameworks like CRT, intersectionality, or certain secular social justice theories attempt to map and divide humanity using purely worldly, horizontal categories. These frameworks categorize people primarily through power dynamics, oppressor versus oppressed, based on historical race relations, economic status, gender, or intersectional identity groups.
Which, to be fair, are the exact frameworks that a massive portion of modern culture uses to define the good life or to establish moral standing today. Being highly aware of these systemic dynamics and actively working to dismantle them is viewed by many as the definitive righteous path in the modern world.
And that is exactly where the sources draw the battle line. The Reformed theologians assert that elevating these sociological frameworks to the level of ultimate truth is a false gospel.
A false gospel.
Yes, their argument relies entirely on the absolute, unyielding authority of the Psalm 1 binary. They state that God divides humanity by one metric and one metric only: spiritual regeneration. You're either a righteous person transplanted by grace into covenant with God, or you are an ungodly rebel acting autonomously.
So to these authors, any philosophy that attempts to superimpose a different competing dividing line over humanity is fundamentally rebelling against the biblical architecture of reality.
Exactly their point. They argue that to divide the church or society based on socioeconomic class, race, or oppressor-oppressed dynamics is to adopt the counsel of the ungodly and to sit in the seat of the scoffer. They view it as an attempt to replace divine law with human sociology, which they categorize as the ultimate form of modern syncretism.
So for you, the listener who is trying to objectively analyze these sources, the critical question is this. Is taking a beautiful 2,500-year-old poem about a transplanted tree in an ancient irrigation canal and using it to completely invalidate modern, complex sociological movements a massive, unwarranted leap in logic? Or is it logically consistent with their stated theology?
If you understand and grant their starting premises, it is entirely logically consistent. For these Reformed theologians, the authority of the biblical text is absolute, comprehensive, and universally binding. It does not just speak to private internal spirituality, it dictates the fundamental ontological nature of reality.
Right.
If the text declares that the foundational reality of the universe is a binary spiritual division, then by their internal logic, any modern philosophy that attempts to supersede, complicate, or rewrite that specific division must be aggressively rejected. They are not interested in finding a nuanced compromise with modern sociology. They are explicitly rejecting its authority based on their reading of the ancient text.
Whether you personally agree with their contemporary applications or find them deeply problematic, the sheer weight of how these authors treat the text is fascinating. They do not treat Psalm 1 as an archaic piece of pastoral poetry to be admired in a museum. They treat it as an active, living, razor-sharp sword that cuts completely through the fabric of modern culture.
It really is an unyielding perspective.
And honestly, wrestling with their intense interpretation forces us to ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. What is the ultimate uncompromising authority that we are building our own lives upon?
Because it holds a mirror up to the reader and demands a definitive answer. You cannot walk away from the text in a state of neutrality.
Let's pull all of this together and recap the incredible thematic journey we have taken today. We started by dismantling the illusion of a neutral path, realizing that the anonymous doorkeeper of the Psalms demands we pick a side before we can even enter the sanctuary. We mapped the terrifying psychological downward spiral of walking in casual rebellion, standing in practiced sin, and eventually taking a permanent seat with the arrogant scoffers.
And then we saw the alternative.
Yes, we uncovered the intense, growling, lion-like meditation required to survive the heat and the desperate reliance of the transplanted tree tapping into the hidden subterranean canal of grace. We felt the violent, devastating pivot to the wind-swept threshing floor, where the seemingly powerful ungodly are exposed as weightless, doomed chaff.
And finally, we saw exactly how these intense sources use this ancient, unyielding binary to launch deeply polarized, heavily weaponized critiques against modern church pragmatism, mysticism, and sociological frameworks. It is a text that fundamentally demands a reaction. And if we bring the weight of this ancient poem directly back to you, the listener, the questions it asks are inescapable. What is your actual Torah? What counsel are you walking in on a daily basis?
Because you are being formed by something.
Exactly. You are being continuously formed by something. The algorithms you scroll, the peer groups you engage with, the news cycles you consume, the media you binge, none of them are neutral. They are all actively catechizing you. They are offering you a worldview. You are either being intentionally, deliberately planted by a source of living water, or you are slowly, imperceptibly drying out in the wind, waiting for the gravity of reality to expose your lack of roots.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over. The sources we explored today insist on a strict, unyielding, absolute binary. You are either a deeply rooted tree or you are entirely weightless chaff destined for the wind. But think about your own actual life and the complex, messy people in it.
Yeah, life is messy.
If we apply this ancient, uncompromising binary lens to a modern world full of broken people, what happens to the folks we love who seem to be wandering somewhere in the terrifying, confusing middle? Does the logic of this ancient text demand that we rigorously categorize them, write them off as scoffers, and aggressively separate ourselves to protect our own purity?
That's the big question.
Or, if we are truly a transplanted tree, deeply rooted by an inexhaustible river of grace, does the text demand that we ensure our own roots are strong enough and our branches wide enough to offer them shade from the blistering heat while they figure out where they are walking? We started this deep dive asking how to define the good life. Maybe the good life isn't just about surviving the wind for yourself. Maybe it's about being the kind of rooted tree that a wandering, exhausted world can take refuge under.
That is a profound, beautiful tension to navigate, and it is exactly the kind of question this text forces us to carry.
It has been an incredibly challenging and fascinating deep dive into the original source material. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the doorway to the Psalms, keep asking the hard questions, keep fiercely examining the counsel you are listening to, and keep diving deep. We will catch you next time.